Recovery has two parts that we've discussed in the past. The first part, of course, is bringing the machine back online and putting it into a place where it can continue to function. We did that as soon as we told the system to automatically remediate and to roll back. We are able to now put those systems back into the network and have them operate normally. That's fantastic. Now, the second part of recovery then is to harden the system a bit to make sure that the attacker does not return and do the same thing they just did, that we just fixed. Now, we've got a number of different solutions for that. The biggest, of course, will be blacklisting. And as part of the eradication functionality, we did request that the executable files be blacklisted. So now if the GANCrab file shows up anywhere on the network, it will now be immediately discovered by file analysis and marked as malicious, and depending on how our policy is set, most likely immediately quarantined, preventing it from ever having a chance to execute again. And as long as we can identify unique files to do that, that is a good thing. However, what happens when the attack is more complex than that? Now, in this case, this is a sort of a silly example because of the attack we happen to do, but let's assume for a moment that this particular phrase, this command line, uniquely identifies this attack. Now, we can choose anything that we can find within the deep visibility storyline. So in other words, we have other examples where an attack is completely placed into various registry keys, or it creates very specific procedures on the system, or has a unique process name, or one of those things. If there's not specifically a file that can be detected by our file analysis tools, then we have to create a different method of detecting that file. So let's look at, for example, Windows System32 WinMic shadow copy delete. This will most likely happen in most cases when there is a ransomware attack. This is a common thing to run. So first of all, let's create a query from this. Not hard to do. Click on the purple circle and check this off, this particular field. Come down here and create a query from selected values. So here we go. We've now created a query for every time this happens. There's only 114 events, and in this case, I would venture to say that if we're seeing shadow copy delete going on our network somewhere, this is probably a malicious activity. There aren't many normal activities where we would go in and we would delete shadow copies. If there are, for example, you have some sort of process that you know may occur on your network that does delete shadow copies, or for some reason you as an administrator delete shadow copies in order to, in some sort of maintenance for the systems, then you may want to make sure that this is only a suspicious activity and not a malicious one. But for now, we're going to assume that this is a malicious activity. Now, it is possible to save the query. So we can click on Save New Query. I can enter a name for it. And then I would be able to simply call back this query and run it whenever I so please. And that's good. That does mean that you, of course, created a manual way of searching for this particular command line, which isn't a terrible thing. It's just that it's not as far as we can go. What you can do is you can create custom rules. This is a new function. For those of you who have been around our product for a time, you may remember our watch lists. Watch lists were an old way of doing this, and what they would do is run the query on a regular basis and then inform you if it actually found something. However, in this case, when I click on custom rule, I get to name this rule. ransomware attack. And I'm going to say rule severity is high. I probably even could consider it critical. I'm going to call this a permanent rule. Why would there be a temporary rule like this? If, for example, I was dealing with an attack that was hitting a very specific vulnerability inside software installed on our systems, and that vulnerability was going to get a patch. So eventually the vulnerability is going to go away once the patch is installed. So therefore I would create a temporary rule that would expire sometime after the patch was installed. This is especially true if you know you need to patch something, however you can't because the system is on some sort of maintenance window that prevents you from patching and rebooting at this time. Maybe you have to wait till next week, maybe you have to wait till next month, or whatever it is, whatever the patch schedule on that system is. And meanwhile, it is vulnerable to the attack. So therefore, you'd like to create a rule that says, hey, while this is vulnerable, I want to know it happens. A permanent rule, like this one, will simply always exist. There is a limit to the number of custom rules you are to create. There's also a little bit of governance that goes into this as well. If your custom rules bring back thousands of hits, then they may be governed. So it is best to, when you create your rules, to try to figure out a rule that brings back very few hits that are specific to what you want, and not kind of a carpet bomb attack or effect where it brings back thousands of results all the time. If that's what it does, I do know that the system will eventually kick it out as being too noisy and prevent it from actually functioning. In this case, the 114 events that we're going to get from the webmic shadow copy delete is not going to be high enough to warrant any sort of governance. I'm going to create it as a permanent rule, and I'm going to go to next. As you can see here, it puts my rule into the events area here. I can edit it if I so choose. Maybe I figured out this is good, but there's a few more things I can do to be more specific about what it is. Or maybe it's too specific. Maybe I'm looking for a particular hash or a particular storyline in my rule, and I'm realizing at this point that if I do that, I'm not going to get the results I need. Which brings me back to, this is going to be something that you have to experiment with a little to make sure you are getting everything that you need. For those of you who have experience utilizing and creating regular expressions, this is kind of a similar thing. A regular expression defined too broadly brings in too many things. In this case, a custom rule defined too broadly will bring in too many things, which A, will do the governance thing, but B, will cause false positives. And the more false positives, the more headaches you will create for yourself. If, however, I define my rule too narrowly, and I'm too specific about it, then the attack will continue and we will actually produce false negatives. False negatives are actually worse in some ways because now the attack continues and you don't have an alert for it. So consequently, be very specific, but be as broad as you can, but be as specific to bring it down to exactly what you'd like it to see so that it actually does what you need it to do. Once you have your query defined, you can choose the scope as well. So keep this in mind. If for some reason you know that this attack only affects specific machines in a specific site or a specific account, then you can adjust this appropriately. Next, once this rule occurs, what do you want it to do? This is basically marrying it to your policy settings. If I treat it as a threat, it's either going to be a suspicious or a malicious threat, at which point, whenever this rule is found, the storyline that it's associated with will automatically be considered either suspicious or malicious. Just like we did earlier manually, where we named that entire storyline as, in this case, malicious, then This would do the same thing and automatically activate any policy restrictions that have to do with that level of problem. If I don't do anything here, it will simply alert. So I will get nothing more than an alert that says I have found this rule and it's happening in these places, which it'll come up as an incident, but it'll just be a alert incident and the system will take no automatic action against it. In this case, shadow copy delete is most likely malicious. I could mark this as a malicious threat and have it be pretty much okay. But remember I said maybe you use shadow copy delete in your system somewhere for some process, in which case you may want to call this suspicious, or you may, if you use shadow copy delete a lot, simply want to be notified of its use. In this case, I'm going to mark it as malicious. The next one down here is network quarantine, and this is simply a checkbox, yes or no. This will override the policy and say, you know what? Regardless of what the policy says, if the policy says to quarantine it, it will. If it's part of the malicious policy to quarantine a system, it will be quarantined. However, you can inform the system, I would like to quarantine that system regardless. So I could actually treat this not as a threat. I could just say to alert on this, but then quarantine the system off of the network. By quarantining the system, it works just the same as it does if I quarantine the system as part of the policy, or if I go in and manually do it myself. It'll put in an extra firewall rule at the top of the list that blocks all traffic in and all traffic out, except for the console and any specific exceptions you have created on the exceptions tab in the networking area. I'm not going to quarantine this at this time. I'm just simply going to treat it as a malicious threat. Gives me a nice summary, and then I can choose whether or not to activate the rule. I'm just going to save it as a draft. To see the rules after you've created them, all you need to do is come up here to the deep visibility area, go to custom rules, and the rule will be listed here. It'll talk about who created it and whether or not it is a draft rule or if it is an active rule. If you'd wish to activate the rule, you can check it off, go to actions, and you can say activate. When I'm done with it, I can then either delete it or I can deactivate it if I'm no longer utilizing it. By default, you can have up to 100 rules in the system. If you wish to add more rules, then you need to add licensing to do that. I believe you can purchase them in groups of 300. So your first group will give you 300 more, which means added to the 100 you get normally, you'd have 400 rules. The next group you buy will give you 300 more, which will give you 2 times 300, which is 600, plus the 100 that you get, which is 700 rules. A lot of times people don't need that many rules. Because remember, you don't need to deal with rules to deal with file objects. You can always blacklist those. However, this is going to enable you to do any sort of rule based off of deep visibility, which then leads me to say, if, for example, you are looking for some sort of indicator of compromise, be they websites or they IP addresses or things like that, it is absolutely possible to create a broader rule. For example, if I wanted to be alerted anytime the source IP address was one of 100 different IP addresses, I could create one rule and list all 100 IP addresses in that one rule. In fact, I can go beyond that. I could then say or, and then add another source IP address entity and add up to 100 more. The in command is limited by 100 objects. So if I say IP address in and I list out a bunch of things, I am limited to 100 per combination of field and search. However, that does not mean I can't use the same field and search multiple times in the same query and or them together, and then I can have 100 and then another one or another 100 or another 100 and so on and so forth. The only limiting factor at that point is going to be the length of the query, which is some 8,000 characters. You'll probably likely hit that first before you hit the 20 combinations. So The three things that will limit you are 100 things in an in statement, 20 combinations. So in other words, 20 combinations of a field and something to search for. You're only allowed to have 20 of those, or a total of 8,000 characters in the search. Whichever one you hit first will stop the process from moving forward. It actually will not save that query. So in that case, it is possible to create more generic rules that go across multiple indicators of compromise in one rule. So if you're thinking about it in those terms, it is possible to create very broad rules that are still based off of indicators of compromise and keep well within your 100 usually. Only very large organizations require the need for many more. And of course, if we are already searching for that and the AI already detects it, there's no reason for you to create a rule about it. Once the rules are created, I would recommend auditing them on a regular basis, which means, of course, the description field, which I did not do anything with, should be very explicit as to what you're looking for and why you're looking for it, and possibly even when you put it in here. However, when you put it in here is actually part of the process. So you might want to look at this and say, okay, I'm going to review all rules created prior to July of 2020, and I'm going to investigate each one to make sure that that rule is still necessary. And if it is, we can keep it. If it is not, then we can delete it. But that needs to become an ongoing process when you use these rules. Keep in mind also that what these rules will do is anytime this is a detection, it will mark the storyline that it detects as malicious. So it's not just the thing that you selected here. If there's an entire process, for example, in this case, there may be multiple things that this storyline did. It may have adjusted files, it may have added registry entries, it may have created different processes here and there. The entire storyline will be marked as either suspicious or malicious, and the automatic processes will automatically deal with it as an entire storyline. Thus, this is actually called Storyline Automated Remediation, or STAR. So when you hear about STAR rules, this is exactly what they're talking about, and it is a very powerful tool to prevent the return of an attacker once you've identified the artifacts of his or her attack.